And there are up to 140,000 homes sitting vacant around Australia, according to figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It's prompting calls for governments to do more to discourage property owners leaving buildings vacant or derelict, especially during the housing crisis. To discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Kathy Sherry from Macquarie University, who specialises in property law. Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Let's start before this situation about the vacant houses and about the legal framework that is set up right now, as we know it, around housing.
Well, I think the important thing to understand about housing and all private property is that it's always being regulated by law, whether we're aware of it or not. And law regulates private property for the benefit of individuals, but also the benefit of the entire community. So it's never the case that people can just do with their private property as they please. We're always being regulated. So, you know, I could build a factory on my land and it would be very economically advantageous for me, but I'm not allowed to do that because that would harm the community around me. So I think it's really important when we discuss regulation of property that we start from the correct starting point, and that is that private property is always regulated by the government for the community's benefit. There's nothing revolutionary about that.
And there are extraordinary a number of laws and regulations and layers and taxation that comes with that as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use, there's regulation that says you can only use your property in a particular way. For example, landlords can't rent property that is not fit for human habitation, even if that would be advantageous for them. But we also use tax law as carrots and sticks to get people to use their private property in a particular way. So we have a whole range of tax laws that regulate private property. Unfortunately, in the past 20 to 30 years, we've had a lot of tax laws that encourage people to use private residential property to build personal wealth. And it's one of the big reasons that we find ourselves in the mess that we are currently in.
Yeah, which is a whole other conversation. I suspect you're going there, particularly to negative gearing and capital gains tax, and a lot of the big areas that I'm sure will come up again at the next federal election as they have in the past. I want to take you specifically to this new report that's out around vacant housing. At first blush, what is your observation of this and this staggering number of potentially 140,000 homes that are vacant?
Yeah, it is a large number. I think it's really good that we're getting better figures on this because up until now, no one's been really clear about how many properties are vacant, but people do have a good idea that it's a significant number. I think it really matters because one of the things that's essential to realise about residential property is that first it meets a basic human need. So a home is not an optional consumer item. No one would choose to be homeless. You can't have any kind of halfway decent life unless you have a home. The second thing to understand is that land is finite. We can't actually manufacture more. So I can park 3 cars in my garage and not use them, and it won't affect anyone else's ability to have a car because a manufacturer can just make another car. That is not the way land works. So if I have 3 properties and I keep them vacant, that potentially has an effect on my fellow citizens. New South Wales is currently trying to manufacture more land in the sense that we're trying to build higher, we're trying to get more housing on smaller blocks of land. The density. But that's not easy. We're struggling in that regard. And it's not easy in part because land is finite. There aren't an unlimited number of plots of land in New South Wales that you can build a 50-storey high-rise residential building on. So we need to bear those two things in mind in relation to residential property, that it is essential and it is finite, and that needs to inform all of our laws, including tax laws, in relation to property. And so, for example, a vacant property tax, although normally people would be free to use their land as they please, including leaving it vacant, if we reach a point in time that is actually actively harming other citizens, then it's entirely appropriate for governments to use tax law to incentivise people to put property back on the rental or sale market.
And where that's in place, I understand, in other parts of Australia and around the world, and that is just a big stick, isn't it, to say, landlord A, you have a vacant property that has been vacant for a certain amount of time, you must take action to rent this out. I suspect it doesn't work as simply as I just outlined it, though.
Yet, no. So there are a number of jurisdictions that have introduced it. Victoria certainly has recently introduced it in Australia. We have vacant property taxes at federal level for foreign investors. They've existed for a while. I know that San Francisco, Ireland, the UK, Spain, France, they've all introduced vacant property taxes. So this is a global problem. And they need to be fine-tuned. There are reasons why people might leave property vacant. They might be renovating it. They might genuinely use two homes. They're actually moving between houses. They use them quite genuinely. The Victorian legislation is nuanced in that way, but it's entirely possible to write good legislation that way to provide people with that incentive, that stick that says if you leave your property vacant, you're going to be hit with a tax. Some people may choose to absorb it. For some people, that might be the incentive they need to put it back on the rental market or to sell it.
You've been working in this space, particularly the wraparound laws when they affect property for a number of decades. Do you have a sense of why people leave properties empty for such a long time? Like, we're not talking about a couple of months here. One of those that was reported on in the ABC, it appears like it's been vacant for decades.
Well, we've been in a decades-long housing boom in Australia. I mean, one thing that is unusual about Australia is we didn't have a correction to our property market in the way many countries did around the GFC. So property has been rising in value in Australia for about 30 years now. So people have been making extraordinary amounts of capital gain with every year. And the times that people have expected a correction, like the GFC or COVID, in actual fact, property has just risen, yes, even stronger. So people are making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on capital gain in property, more than they could ever make actually doing a job and earning income. So that's why people are leaving them vacant often, because the big ticket item for them is the capital gain, not the income they'd get from a tenant.
And look, just finally, can I get you to briefly to touch on this other story that's in the news today around the lack of housing approvals that I think it goes to some point that you made earlier about the density question, but we're just not seeing enough approvals for the demand, are we?
That's up for debate. So,
okay.
yeah. So developers,
correct me.
Yeah, developers in Sydney have housing approval for developments all over Sydney, which they're not using. There's no silver bullet to this issue to solve this problem. So it's not just a question of, allow developers to build whatever they want, we'll get enough supply, it'll solve the problem. Developers are never going to flood the market with enough product to depress the price of the thing that they're selling.
They're trying to increase the price.
That just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And also, in fairness to developers, construction costs are going up. Wages are going up. It is very difficult for them to make profit in the current market. The problem is that Australia has, in the last 30 years, basically exclusively relied on the private sector to build our housing, and that's just never going to work. We need some government supply of housing.